Hello. So there's a big feeling of discontent in the UK at the moment. The gap between rich and poor is too big, corporations are too large, houses are too expensive, and a whole generation of people has been priced out. And these are actually quite simple problems to solve, at least in theory. They just involve a fundamental change in policy and in thinking. And we're going to come to that in a moment. But I want to first talk about land prices. Now, did you know that 70% of land in the UK belongs to just 6,000 people? The Crown, a few corporations, and a few posh rich people. Most people pay an average of £600 a year in council tax, while these wealthy landowners actually receive many times that in subsidy from our government, and then they receive the same amount again in subsidy from the EU. Now, that data actually comes from Kevin Cahill in his book Who Owns Britain. That was written shortly after the turn of the century. The data might have changed a little bit, but there is no arguing with the fact that the ownership of land in the UK is not properly distributed. Now, in 2011, we had a thing called the National Ecosystem Assessment. Very interesting report into land in England and Wales, went completely ignored. But the key finding was this: domestic buildings cover just 1.1% of land in England and Wales, 1.1%. Non-domestic buildings cover another 0.65%, and roads cover just over 2.2%. So just 4% of land in England and Wales is actually built on. I'm looking over here at the numbers. The other 96% is made up of gardens, which is about 5%, water about 3%, and the rest is just green space. Now, if you fly over the UK, you'll see acre and acre of barely used land. Some of it's utterly beautiful, some of it is environmentally sensitive, of course, but a lot of it isn't. A lot of it is just field. Now, I should really post pictures of unused, boring fields here, but I won't. So, you've got all this land being subsidised. Meanwhile, anyone born after about 1985 can't afford a house. The average age of the first-time buyer here in London is now close to 40. He or she will be a pensioner before they can start a family. Over 50% of young people believe they will never own a place to live. 50% of young people. It's insane. High house prices have psychologically damaged people. There's a whole generation of youngsters who feel completely inadequate because they can't buy a home. And yet, if you do a quick search online, a 2-bed timber-framed house costs like 25 grand or something. You can buy a 5-bed, 2-storey, 3,500 square foot timber-framed house for less than £70,000. And you can buy 3D printers can print homes for less than £5,000. Houses do not cost a lot of money to build, yet house prices are destroying the prospects of an entire generation. So let's park that thought for now. So in the 1980s, there was a huge housing boom in the UK, and it was driven largely by new systems of money and credit. And all this newly created money and credit went into housing prices and pushed them up. People didn't care about that. They just saw their house appreciating in value. There was also this thing introduced by the Conservative Party called right to buy, which enabled people who lived in a council house to buy their house at a discount, which a lot of people did. They then benefited from this asset price inflation too. And there was a huge boom, and everybody felt very rich, and it made the Conservatives and Mrs. Thatcher extremely popular. But then in 1989, the housing market topped out, and people started to find themselves in a thing called negative equity, which is when the value of debt you have is greater than the value of the house. So, for example, you might have a 110 grand mortgage, but the house is only worth 100 grand. And so suddenly, when you're in negative equity, you think, well, why am I bothering to own this house? Then interest rates started to go up. People couldn't afford the mortgages to service the mortgages on their houses. And many just walked away. And we had tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of repossessions. People lost their home. And it made the Conservative Party I mean, the bust got so painful, I should say, it made the Conservative Party unelectable for half a generation. And the lessons learned by both parties is that in order to stay popular, you must prop up the housing market at all costs. Owners, for some reason, are more likely to vote than renters. Did you know that? And so that has been the kind of fundamental driver of government policy ever since. And it was particularly apparent in the reaction to the 2008 financial crisis, when we got quantitative easing and zero interest rate policies and bailing out the banks and all the rest of it. When you pump huge amounts of credit, in fact, when you have whole industries built on creating credit, not to mention loose monetary policy, suppressed interest rates, help to buy, the aggressive marketing of property overseas, all these things, it's inevitable when you pump all of that into this tiny pocket of land on which we're able to live, it's inevitable that house prices are going to be pumped up way beyond earnings. In London, house prices are currently at 14 times earnings, 14 times. Healthy is supposed to be 3.5. So the earlier you get onto the credit ladder, the luckier you are. And I bet as many as 80 or 90% of the people you know that own a house in London would not now be able to buy the house in which they live. It's become almost impossible to work your way onto the ladder. Yet, if you're a young person starting out in life, the only option you have, unless you're born into a rich family, is to work. And while you're working, you have to pay rent, which means somebody else is benefiting from your labour. You also have to pay income tax, which by the time you factor in national insurance, even for low income people, is over 30%. And if you work really hard, you're likely to get into a higher income tax category of 45% and pay more tax. So if you're looking to close the wealth gap, and on the one side of the equation, you've got this land system and this money system that pushes up the price of the thing that you want to buy. And on the other side of the wealth divide, you have you who's working, but all the time you're paying tax and having your earnings scraped away from you. The gap between you and the things you want to own gets bigger and bigger. And that is how the wealth gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And all that land that's held by the few, meanwhile, goes completely untaxed. The whole economy is rigged so that wealth transfers from those that earn to those that own. And that is, in my opinion, not remotely fair. We pay income tax at one high rate, we pay corporation tax at a modest rate, and in many cases we pay no land tax at all. And if we're to level the playing field, if we're to reduce inequality, if we are to make it possible for a worker to compete with a corporation or a landowner, then we have to tax those three things equally. Imagine that. Income tax, corporation tax, and land tax, all at the same equal rate. And that is a route to a more equal society. So that's the end of this vlog. Yet again, I've rather enjoyed doing it. If you liked listening to it, sign up to my YouTube channel or sign up to my blog. You can sign up to my blog on the links below. And I suppose I should plug my book, really. Life After the State, which was written about all this kind of thing. And you can buy it on Amazon or you can buy it at lifeafterthestate.com. And if you're skint or hard up, just send me an email through my website, dominicfrisby.com, and I'll email you a free copy. Digital.